Welcome to Protect What Matters, Estate and Elder Law with Tim Murray.
Welcome to Protect What Matters, Estate and Elder Law with Tim Murray, a Evan Mack lawyer in Indiana. Tim has more than 35 years of experience helping Indiana families with estate planning, probate, and elder law matters. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about Medicaid and long-term care planning in Indiana and what families should know early. Tim, my man, welcome back.
Thank you, Evan. Good to be back.
Good to see you, Tim. So when families start thinking about long-term care, what situations usually bring Medicaid into the conversation in the first place?
Well, usually I'll be contacted by a family, and someone in the family is starting to need extra care, or they need to be looked after, or something's happened. They leave the stove on and forget about it, or they are forgetting things. You know, the early signs of dementia, Alzheimer's are setting in. The things that you may hear about do happen to people, and I'll get a call about that. And if we're lucky, I get a call early enough that we can catch things early, and we can maybe keep the person at home with certain things in place. But then the things that usually kick it are how am I going to, number one, if I do end up in long-term care, how am I going to pay for it? And how, if I'm comfortable and I have a home and maybe I have an investments and I have some money, but how long is it going to last if I have to pay $1,000 a month to a long-term care facility? So those are the things and concerns that get people in to talk to me or get people to ask questions about things.
So Tim, how is Medicaid different from Medicare when it comes to paying for nursing homes or long-term care in Indiana?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I always love the fact that they've named two things all so closely together and so sounding together that they get confused and interrelated so much, and they aren't. They should have named one Medicaid and the other one like Medicant or something like that. But Medicare, okay, can be put into place at several different places, but most of the time and predominantly what we're used to seeing is when you turn 65, Medicare is health insurance, and it is not built for long-term care. However, it can pay for a long-term care situation, but only up to 100 days. And there's co-pays and different things. But Medicare can pay for some of your nursing home care on a short-term basis. Medicaid, on the other hand, and in Indiana, there's about 28 different types of Medicaid, all the way, everything from MediWorks to a disabled kind of situation with Medicaid. But the one I like to focus on for families and where I think they need it the most is for those people who are 65 and over and who have become basically incompetent because of their old age or dementia and need nursing home care. And we loosely call it nursing home Medicaid is what we call that. So, and that's where Medicaid then hops in and provides assistance in long-term care situations if you qualify.
Timing seems to matter when it comes to this Medicaid planning. Why does planning early look so different from planning during a crisis?
Planning early can change everyone's lives, including the people who need Medicaid and long-term care assistance and their families. Planning early, I guess there's two schools of thought on this, and I kind of talk to people about this. You can say that, hey, everything I've made and everything I have in my treasure chest, I'm going to use to take care of me, and if I want to spend it on my health care and my nursing home care, that's up to me. And if there's anything left over, I'll let it go to my kids or my nieces and nephews or whomever I say. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin are people who don't want that to happen. They want to protect everything that they've built, or as much as they can. They don't want it to go, and a lot of people say it this way, not my words, to the government, to have to pay for their long-term care. And they do want to find some way that Medicaid would help them and not put their assets at jeopardy. And there's different ways of doing that and planning through that. So later on, it's more called, and I always tell people, if you want to plan early, you need to have 5 healthy years in front of you that you're healthy enough that you're not going to apply for Medicaid. Otherwise, your alternative is to wait and see what happens. And if you get into crisis planning, something happens and you've not done any kind of asset or estate planning in preparation for long-term care, like I just said, crisis planning. What do we do? And there are situations and things that strategies you can use to minimize the risk and minimize the damage from a crisis planning situation.
But Tim, do you have a situation where a family waited too long to look at Medicaid planning, and and the options were limited, like in later on?
I've had a lot of situations and well, they call it the spend down to qualify for Medicaid and things like that. I've had some situations where a family didn't realize that they had maybe done things incorrectly, or they've done their own do-it-yourself type of thing. But most people who have touched a little bit on Medicaid have heard about a 5-year look-back period. You have to, any assets you've transferred within the last 5 years, Medicaid is going to take a look at. And if they're a non-exempt transfer, which means we're going to bring that back in and penalize you for it. Those are the things that I find people get penalized for the most. I've had situations where people deeded the house into their kids' names, and in 2 years, they're sitting in a nursing home applying for Medicaid, and Medicaid slaps them on the wrist and says, you can't do that. You need to bring that house back in. And there's ways that people get penalized for transferring those assets like a house or cash, and they can't support it, that it's an exempt transfer. Exempt transfers in the eyes of Medicaid are okay, and you won't get penalized for those when you apply for Medicaid. So predominantly what I see, and a couple of the situations that I've recently that I could think of in answering your question, are people who waited and didn't do anything, thinking that gifting or maybe putting my son's name on my checking account will keep that money from being looked at by Medicaid, or all these kind of things. And it just, with a little bit of planning, a lot of those kind of situations can be avoided.
So what kind of assets tend to raise the most questions, though, Tim, or for families when they're trying to understand this eligibility for Medicaid?
The biggest ones I think are real estate, your home. In my area, we have a lot of people who have farmland, people who are farmers, or people who have farmland that they've purchased or inherited over the years, and they cash rent it. They're basically tenant or landlord farmers kind of situation. So that's the biggest assets most people own, are the real estate and their homes. And how do we protect that, or those assets, from have to be cashed out and spent on nursing home care? Otherwise, other large assets can be IRAs, 401ks that we've accumulated and invested in over the years, and how those can be handled. In Indiana, anyway, the IRAs now will be part of what's counted in calculating how things will play out with Medicaid. And I'm not going to get into any kind of in-depth discussions about Medicaid today, Evan. I just want to touch on this. I'm going to do this and not a deep dive so much, because that's a monstrous topic to have to talk about. And any particular issue in Medicaid, you could spend several hours talking about. But real estate, IRAs, and investment accounts, I have found, are the two biggest assets that people have, and the two biggest assets that they are dealing with when it comes to concerns about long-term care, and how can I protect these things from long-term care expenses and nursing home costs.
So Tim, how does owning a home, like you said, factor into this planning, especially for people who want to protect the home?
Sure.
Like what things do they need to do to kind of help out when it comes to this situation?
There's a few different techniques and things you can strategize about. My favorite one, it's not for everyone, my favorite one to recommend to people, especially if you have healthy years in front of you, is to investigate and research and look into we call it an asset protection trust. Some people call it a Medicaid trust. It's an irrevocable asset protection trust that is set up to protect your home and any other assets from accidents, from being sued, from long-term care costs. Now, as far as long-term care costs go, those assets have to have been in the asset protection trust for 5 years to be 100% protected. There's ways that if you fall short of that 5-year period to manage things and lessen the risk and exposure, but 5 years is the magic number to have them 100% protected from nursing home and long-term care costs. They're immediately protected from our lawsuits. So if I'm driving down the road and I have an accident and my auto insurance doesn't pay for everything, they're going to come looking for Tim Murray assets to maybe make up the difference or something like that. If I have assets that I'm holding in an asset protection trust, they can't touch those. So I can put investments in there that make money. I can put real estate in there that pays rent, and I get the rent, I get the income, I get the interest, I get stock dividends. All that continues to pay to me. I can do things in that trust that are wonderful, and those assets are protected. That's my number one way of having people exposed to some of the ideas. There are some deed situations. I almost forgot what the question was, but I'm coming back to that. There's some other some deed situations that could help in reducing the exposure to long-term care costs. A life estate deed is the primary one, and you can do a life estate deed to people, to a trust, and it reduces the amount of the asset that gets transferred that you get penalized on if you get caught short of making it to 5 years. And that sounded confusing to me. So I hope if anybody hears this, just pick up the phone and call an estate planning attorney, me or anyone else, and make an appointment, because it's worthy of more explanation and understanding how all these transfers and how these techniques work. Also, the worst is trying them on your own and having them get screwed up, and it ends up blowing up in your face, and you lose tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that you didn't need to.
So Tim, what about this though? How do married couples face different considerations than single individuals when it comes to this long-term care planning?
Sure. I talk to people when a married couple, I talk to a married couple when they come in, and I break it down into two different conversations essentially. And I always, number one, I always tell people, it's hard to be one and done when you come in and talk about estate planning and these issues. I only like to wear people down for about an hour, and then hour and 15 minutes, and then we need to schedule another appointment because it's just a lot of information. But a married couple, most married couples don't both go into long-term care at the same time, but they can, and it does happen. And I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to talk about, you have a community spouse and you have an institutional spouse. Community spouse is the one that gets to stay home. They're healthy. Institutional spouse in a nursing home, long-term care. What do we do? How do we protect assets? How do we make sure that the community spouse, the one that's home, isn't destitute, still has money to live on? There are anti-spousal impoverishment rules and laws in place to keep those things from happening, so you don't have to, spend and waste. No, it's not a waste. Spend and deplete all your money to support a spouse to the tune of $7,000 or $8,000 a month in a nursing home. You get to keep the home. You get to keep your car. You get to keep assets and things like that, because we don't want you to be destitute. So there's rules, and it's a very comprehensive discussion to have with a couple, and to make sure they understand that you're not going to go broke. And some people don't understand this, and they keep their spouse at home too long, trying to care for them themselves as an in-home caregiver, which is a good thing in some places, not good in others. Mrs. Murray is not going to be able to take care of 6'4", 225 pounds at home very long. She can't throw me around. She's not going to be able to do the things that need to be done. She's 5'2" and doesn't weigh very much. So there's the physical aspects. There's the emotional aspects. I mean, my own mother-in-law, God rest her soul, she was a wonderful lady. She kept my father-in-law home for over 2 years, and we could all see the physical and emotional wear and tear that it caused on her, and how she came out of that after he passed. 6 months later, she was like a blooming flower. So it does have some issues and things to take care of and need to be addressed. And I think I'm straying away from the original question there. Sometimes I get squirreled and I can go off on a sidetrack there, but yeah,
that was good though.
Yeah,
that was good though. That was good to base on. I like that a little bit more than unpacking the question a little bit more. But so speaking of that though, there's a lot of confusion about these rules and about penalties that can incur. What parts of Medicaid planning tend to cause the most misunderstanding, or maybe I should like the most basic misunderstanding?
I think the 5-year look back rule. I think that causes some misunderstanding about how people think they have to calculate that. There's a lot of people that like to do it yourself, and I think the do-it-yourselfers usually can get into trouble because they don't understand how Part A plays with Part B, plays with Part D, plays with Part Z in Medicaid or asset planning when it comes to the penalties and things that can happen. Or they think that putting a kid's name on is the magic trick, or the gifting. Hey, maybe we can gift. If gifting, it can blow up in your face, and you can be penalized for these things if you don't do it properly. There's so many things that can happen when people just take it for granted that, and I get these things. I'm not making them up. These are things that I have to deal with on a daily basis. Well, I did this because, I read somewhere that if I did this transfer or put their name on this, that it would keep it out of the hands of the nursing homes. Well, that might work if you in California, because maybe they looked something up online, they Googled this, and it pertained to how Medicaid works in California, not Indiana, because Medicaid works differently depending on what state you live in. And there's different ways of doing things. Indiana has different rules than Montana or California. So I'm always cautious when anyone has information to offer me about where it came from, how they found it, what their sources were, and things like that. And not that I don't want people to be educated and look things up on their own, but there's danger in that without making clarification about where the information came from. Another one would be, what they have to do to qualify and the misconceptions people have about what they have to spend and how they can do things. I had a sad tale where some folks came in to see me. It was a daughter and her husband. She was an only child. Her father was dead. They sold mom's farm for $750,000, and mom went into a nursing home. And they got some bad advice from someone who didn't understand assets and Medicaid and things. And they got some bad advice, and they were told, you got to spend mom's money down to under $2,000 before you can qualify for Medicaid. And they came to me when mom had $145,000 left out of the 750. And I tried to dance around the topic as best I could without throwing basically another lawyer under the bus. I don't know how else to put it. But the daughter's husband looked at me and said, and he figured it out pretty darn quick. And he said, so if we'd have found somebody like you when mother-in-law still had $750,000, we wouldn't be sitting here with only $145,000 left. And I just said, yep, that's correct. Because you got to go to people who know and understand how Medicaid works with assets and asset protection and transfers and what you've done, and learn the history about all their things and do that. And those are some of the dangers also, is getting bad advice.
So speaking of that, for someone who doesn't need long-term care right now, but wants to be responsible, how do you usually suggest thinking about Medicaid planning as a part of that broader estate plan?
Wow, that's a big question. What comes to my mind when you ask me that is I tell this story in my boot camps. I put on boot camps about estate planning and elder law on a regular basis. Shameless plug. But I tell this story, and I hope it connects with the question. I had a woman come in and meet with me one time, and she was talking about estate planning, and she understood Medicaid very well, probably better than any non-lawyer person that I've met in a long time. But anyway, she knew it because her brother had gone through it with his wife. And I keep track of some odd things, but the youngest person I've ever heard of that had the new record of early onset dementia and had to go to a nursing home, 47 years old. So her sister-in-law had to go into a nursing home with dementia, wiped out her brother's 401k, destroyed him financially just to get her on Medicaid, because she could live another 40 years and have to be supported in the nursing home. And so I'm talking to her, and I said, well, are you and your brother's mom and dad still alive? She said, yeah. And I said, how about your sister-in-law? Are her mom and dad still alive? And she said, well, sure. And I looked at her and I said, well, has anybody talked to them? And that's all the farther I got. Her jaw drops, her eyes get big, and she's like, oh my gosh, like 3 times in a row. She knew, like a bullet to the brain. She knew in that moment, if her and her brother's parents or her sister-in-law's parents died and left assets to her brother or her sister-in-law. It could destroy their Medicaid planning, put them back to ground, get her kicked off Medicaid, be over asset and income limits, and put them right back to having to scrape and scrounge and go through all that horrible spend down and thing all over again. So I guess the answer and the thinking I want to put into people's brains is estate planning now ain't like it was 40 and 50 years ago for grandma and grandpa. It's multi-generational. What I do can affect my kids, my grandkids, or what I fail to do. More importantly, what I fail to do can affect my kids and my grandkids, and we don't plan for that. Did she plan on having dementia at 47? I don't want to go to that school if she did, so we don't plan for these things. And you can't say that it always happens to the other guy. It doesn't happen to me and my family, because that doesn't it's everything's close to home these days, and it does happen to us. So those are the kind of things that I want to expose people to in my boot camps, in my meetings with them, educate them that, these are the things that are going to happen in life. So that's what I have to offer in response to that. It's just it's a heartbreaker, but you can plan through it and prepare for these things, and it's a good thing.
That's good stuff, Mr. Murray. Appreciate the time, sir.
You're welcome, and thank you.
All right. That's it for today's episode of Protect What Matters, Estate and Elder Law with Tim Murray, a Winnie Mac lawyer in Indiana. If you'd like to learn more about Tim Murray and the work he does at Murray Law, you can visit tmurraylaw.com or call that number 574-946-7819. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review so more Indiana families can find clear, practical guidance when they need it. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.